And welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. This is the fifth in our series of webinars and conference calls covering the COVID-19 pandemic. And we've now, as you can see, changed the title, Adapting to the Supply Chain's New Normal. And I think we have a very interesting hour for you as we go through some of the updates. So why don't we get started? So we have the same couple of same speakers and then a new speaker for today. Myself, John Bovitt. I'm with Resolink. I think I know many of you as part of over the years. Also on again speaking this week is with me is Bindia Vakil, who's the founder and CEO. I think many of you know Bindia as well. She's been featured in many articles, even on TV, CNBC, Bloomberg. Recently, several Harvard Business Review articles and other media coverage. So please check out our website to read about those and watch those videos as well. But also, we have a guest today. Is Tom Linton. And this might be not a surprise to many of you, and probably many folks watching today are familiar with Tom and his work over the last, I won't even say how many years. He's formerly the Chief Procurement and Supply Chain Officer at Flextronics. And those of you that are familiar with Flex know that people at Flex are experts in managing supply chains. They manage supply chains for a living. So I think Tom knows a thing or two about helping and advising people through these types of situations that we find ourselves in. He was also formerly spent many years at a long illustrious career at companies such as IBM, E2Open, just to name a few. Tom is also a distinguished speaker and author. You can pick up some of his books as well, and welcome you to do so. So thanks for Tom for joining it. From an agenda perspective, we're going to basically break it into two sessions or sections today. First, we'll give an update on what we're seeing on the data and the metrics around supplier disruptions globally. We thought this would be something that we could update each time we do one of these sessions. We're tracking these each and every day in real time, and then we can report sort of the trends that we're seeing from the last time we gave an update. So that last update, which was 2 weeks ago, we did provide some of this data, and we'll continue to do so moving forward, just to help see the trends and see how the global supply chains are healing, so to speak. And then we'll also do a session with Bindia and Tom on from sort of a CPO's perspective, go through a few topics. We've received some questions and some thoughts ahead of time and wanted to cover some of these topics, so we will. And again, appreciate Tom for joining us today. It should be a real fun session. So one of the things that we also wanted to share with you is that we're actually seeing, I think all of us now are still tracking the flattening the curve, the curve of COVID-19 patients. And we at Resolink are also tracking a different curve, but related in terms of the supply chain disruptions globally. And one of the things we wanted to do, as I mentioned, was kind of share this each time we get together and just see how things are moving. Just by way of quick introduction to the data, we touched on this last time, but I'll just cover it real fast, just for those that weren't on last sessions. That we have a service called Event Watch, which is actually a supply chain event monitoring service. And as part of that service, we actually receive confirmations from suppliers. We send out that, hey, Mr. Supplier or Mrs. Supplier, this event we believe disrupted you. Can you confirm or not? And so we've been gathering that data since the beginning of the pandemic back in January. And you can see that we can sort of trace the lines and track this. And I'm going to give you a few different views to think about. So the interesting thing is that we gather this data, and as we continue down this road, in the coming months, we'll be able to see how the trend line is and report that back to you. So just by way, this data is as of April 18th. And as of that date, we see no sign of a slowdown in the growth of global supply chain disruptions at this point. It looks like on the green line that it's actually trending down, but that's actually because it's only as of mid-April, as of this 18th. So actually that line will actually continue to trend. We also drew a projection out using a exponential growth curve, and we believe that if you forecast out into May, May could even double where we are currently. So if we'll report back in a few weeks around that. But if that were to continue, if that trend continues, then we will continue to see the number of disruptions grow. So the question is, can we predict these? And that's one of the things that we're working on. And here we can help to try to forecast, but you can see these trends will probably continue for the foreseeable future. Another thing that we wanted to do was share a heat map, and this will be interesting to show how this changes over time as well. One of the things that we can notice too is by looking at the heat map, what jumps out at you? Well, the one thing is obviously the U.S. We're seeing that the U.S. has by far the most potential disruptions around the globe. And I'll slice and dice this a little bit more on the next couple slides, but it's interesting that just in sheer potential disruptions, that the U.S. is outpacing everybody else, all other kind of geographies. But if you also look at China and Japan are the next highest, and that's kind of what we would expect. I'll cover those a little bit more in detail, but that's sort of the view that we're seeing right now. And also just from the global picture, I guess some spots in African countries, not necessarily seeing disruptions yet, but most of the globe is feeling disruptions to some degree. So let's peel it back a little bit more, and I think it's very interesting to look at some of the data country by country. So again, these numbers are actually unique suppliers. So these represent a unique supplier and disruptions to them. So a couple of things you can see. Let's take it kind of geography by geography, and I have a few of these charts. So on the left-hand side, let's look at Asia Pac first, and I just actually chose some of the highlights. We have an even more granular view if people are interested. But the one thing you'll notice is which ones are on the decline and which ones are on the increase. And again, these numbers are as of April 18th. So they will, the ones that are on the rise will be even higher by the end of April, and then probably even we'll have to see what the trend is going into May. But you can see clearly from these diagrams that China, Taiwan, and Malaysia are on the downswing. That's pretty clear. Whereas Japan and Singapore are on the upswing, particularly Japan. That one, even 2 weeks ago jumped out at me, and I highlighted that in our last presentation. But since then, Japan and suppliers in Japan have continued to get disrupted. So that's Asia Pac. What about some select countries in Europe? Well, again, you can see some of the trends. So from sort of a peak last month for France, Italy, and Spain, and they're clearly on the decline. In fact, I believe it was France that I couldn't find any suppliers that were disrupted so far in April, which is a really great sign. But you can see those three countries, again, France, Italy, and Spain, dropped significantly in the number of disruptions, which is really encouraging. But what's less encouraging is the United Kingdom, where you can see the jump is extreme. It matches nearly the rate of incline disruptions in Japan. So again, while some countries are showing improvements, some are actually significantly growing in the disruption. So I think this is something to consider as you're doing your planning. Let me drill in a little bit more on this topic. So one of the other things that I wanted to take a look at and share today was around US, Mexico, and Canada. Now, one thing first I want to do, as the US is having, as I mentioned, having the most disruptions, I actually plotted them on two different sides. So on the right-hand side is the index for United States. And then on the left-hand side is Mexico and Canada. So at first I was like, oh, United States is on the decline, which actually it does appear that the rate of disruptions has dropped in the US, which again is encouraging. The numbers are still, several times that of Canada and Mexico in terms of sheer number of suppliers that have a disruption. But the one thing that this does highlight is look at the trend for Canada and Mexico. Look at the incline for Mexico. I think this is worth watching as we report out in coming sessions. Again, are these trends following? It really seems to me that the United States is still seeing continued disruptions. So it's either flat or growing somewhat, because again, we're talking mid-April now, the data. But you can clearly see Mexico and Canada are on the incline. And so this is definitely worth keeping an eye on, and we'll continue to report on this data as we go forward. Now, the other thing that we touched on last time, which I thought was interesting, and I wanted to change it up a little bit, was to, as I mentioned, one of the things that we do as part of our Event Watch service is we receive these confirmations from suppliers. And when they confirm that they were in fact impacted, we do gather by how many weeks. So the one thing that we mentioned last time, but I'll reiterate, is the actual number of weeks was significant. And it actually ranged from 1 to 16 weeks. So we were actually very surprised when we saw a supplier. There was sets of suppliers that actually said, yeah, we'll be impacted even 12 to 16 weeks initially when they responded. So it was pretty significant. I did update the average response for a number of weeks. When a supplier did respond to us and say how many weeks they were disrupted, on average it was 3.3 weeks. And that number is actually down from 3.5 last week. So I think slight improvement there overall. Which may be indicative of an improvement. We'll have to track that again and report out next time. But the interesting thing, what I did was I wanted to see the spikes across the weeks. So these across the bottom, what you're seeing is the days as they go by. So we're sort of seeing the heartbeat of disruptions across the supply chain. The numbers represent the total for that given day, the total in weeks of the disruptions as reported by suppliers themselves. And what was interesting, what really jumped out at me is these peaks, as you can see. So they peaked, and two particular ones really jumped out. And so I did a little digging, a little detective work, and actually, noticed that the first peak I labeled there was actually South Korea. So when South Korea did their lockdown, that caused a big peak. I think there was some other contributors, but that was definitely the big event. And I think we all remember when that happened, and I think it did send some shockwaves throughout the globe, and especially in the supply chains. And then the biggest peak actually was around the time, and I think that's around March 16, 17, 18, that time frame, when really a lot of the global lockdowns started happening, and thus caused a lot of suppliers to report they were disrupted for a lot of weeks. And that's when the borders started closing in Europe, France, Spain, even Israel, San Francisco, California went on lockdown, and Shanghai in China. So you can see this big peak. And since then, there's been some other significant upticks. And I'll peel it back a little bit more as we, in the coming weeks, just to highlight some of this. I think when we look back on the data, when we're all past this, next year, whenever that is, we will look back and see where all these disruptions occurred and see if we can use that data to plan better. But I think it was neat to kind of highlight this and just show you some of the timeline. It's always good to analyze this data. And another kind of dashboard we've been using, and call it a kind of an informal dashboard, was around kind of by different industries. So from high tech, automotive, semiconductor, life sciences, med device, healthcare, food, and consumer goods across the top there, to the kind of the observations that we're tracking for these. This has slowly been, but consistently filling up with red. And as you can see, there's a few that are experiencing increased demand, as we know, from med device and healthcare, life science, and food, as we can all personally attest to. But there's obviously a lot of red, and you can see we're sort of comparing it to the beginning of March, and you can see as things change. There wasn't a huge change from last time, but what we wanted to do was consistently report this so you can start to see the change and eventually the improvements, and hopefully we'll start to see those shortly. So with that, I'm going to continue, and Bindi, I'm going to turn it over to you to discuss with Tom and address some of the questions and topics we wanted to cover today.
Thank you, John, and yeah, thanks for everyone for attending today. As we just saw, the supply chain continues to be disrupted. A couple of key things, and I'm excited today to have Tom Linton. I think many of you may be aware Tom Linton has joined our advisory board as executive director of our advisory board. So very excited to have him advising myself and my team, and by extension our customers, as a key expert in the industry who has really been there, done that many years across many types of disruptions, really. So I think with that, I want to quickly introduce and Tom just kind of talk about welcome first of all, and just talk about, as you can see from all of the data John just shared, companies are reporting all manner of supply chain disruptions right now, from shipment delays, factory downtime, material shortages, allocations, raw material availability. As a chief supply chain officer with responsibility across procurement, logistics, give us kind of your sense of what is going through the minds of supply chain officers right now.
Well, the biggest challenge at the moment is inventory is going to start to dry up in the channel. Right now, in fact, if you look at the previous chart that John showed, only 45%, I think, is recorded as customers are not being satisfied. Demand is not being satisfied. But what's going to happen is that number is going to get worse, because we're starting to see it, for example, in the news on the meatpacking industry, where all of a sudden now the inventory in the channel is drying up and certain things aren't available. All of us have been to a grocery store and we've seen the end of, as a consumer, we've seen how certain things are not available. So I think what we're seeing is this move through the supply chain from the raw material on through, and we're going to see more customer impacts. We're probably, based upon past experience, we're probably really halfway through what the impacts will be. And we're just kind of in the middle of it. And I think as time goes by, as companies adapt, as consumers adapt, as supply chains adapt, it will obviously mitigate. But we're still, based upon the data that I see from Resolink here, is we're still fairly early in the process.
And I agree with that. And I also thought that some of the information that we see across different industries was really interesting, right? Because, I mean, and you've lived and breathed supply chains and the multi-tier supply chain in particular across different industries. So can you talk a little bit about how, disruptions going up in Japan or Singapore, or the spike in South Korea? How is this all interconnected, and what can people see in the next couple of weeks as it relates to the different country movements?
Yeah, well, we learn something in every crisis. So, from the Kobe earthquake in '95 through 9/11, through the Fukushima disaster, through the Great Recession of 2008 and 9. Supply chains learn a little bit more. But one of the things that we did learn in prior events was visibility of data, visibility of supply chain is really, really important. So it's not just knowing what's happening in your first tier, which was kind of like the shock of the Kobe earthquake in '95, but actually as you go through time, the more that you know about the various levels of your supply chain, the feeder, call it the feeder stocks that come into your third tier suppliers up through your second tier suppliers to your first, the visibility to that is now table stakes in supply chain. I mean, if you don't know that information now, at least in your critical suppliers, you're really behind. And you really need to know that. And so that's where I think, a company like Resolink and why I believe in it just provides that visibility tool to get to that data that otherwise would be very difficult to gather or very expensive to gather any other way. So I think this idea of visibility and just on the topic of just, some people talk about visibility and transparency. Well, they're different, right? So visibility is what you see, transparency is what you know. And knowing something really is more like, instead of looking into it, transparency is actually bouncing back at you. When you look in a lake and it's clear, you can see the bottom, but that's because the light is bouncing off the bottom back into your eyes. So a supply chain is like that. You want tools that give you transparency and it actually comes, the data, the information comes back up to you rather than have to crawl down into it. So I think that's the new wave. That's the new dynamic. I think that's why you guys are on some of the cutting edge of it. And that's why right now, if you're unprepared, if you're not prepared with that kind of information, your consumers, your customers, or your executives, whether you're in government or in business, you can't explain what's going on. I mean, the word impact is a very loose word, but if you can't explain that impact in some granular way, you're really just, sitting there just fiddling around, just trying to communicate basic information without having a lot of depth to it.
That's a very interesting. That's a very interesting analogy. Actually, I have a similar one that I always think of, which is, when you're looking at flying and you're flying with VFR, which is the visual rating versus instrument rating, where what I say is when you have Resolink type mapping and transparency type solutions in place in your supply chain, that's almost like having an instrument rating. You're able to fly your plane regardless of the weather, regardless of foggy conditions, because all the data that you need to successfully reach your destination without getting lost is right there in front of you, even though the world itself may not be cooperating.
Right.
But that's a really interesting point, Tom. Speaking of transparency, one thing we see, and John talked about this as well, he talked about, a lot of times suppliers provide information, even what we see is during disruptions, typically we'll see suppliers providing 2 to 3 weeks of impact. COVID was actually one of the first times that we saw suppliers responding with as much as 16 weeks of impact confirmed. And we'd never seen that before. Typically, suppliers try to withhold information. So how would you provide advice to what are some best practices that you see where, companies can be a little bit more open and transparent with their customers? And this actually will be particularly more important as we look at financial stability and all of that. But let's start with transparency and how to gain supplier trust, and then we can go to the next part.
Yeah, well, first, it's interesting you use 16 weeks because actually that's the length of the semiconductor production cycle. And, it's when you think about a wafer being made, if there's a failure at the production level at the beginning in a third tier, say a semiconductor process, it takes 16 weeks for it to recover. So like if there's a fire or an issue with a fab. But I think what we're going to start to see is this inventory, the buffer inventory starts to work its way through the system. and production is being impacted, product companies are going to have clear-to-build problems. A clear-to-build problem is when you need 500 parts to make something, but you're missing one, therefore you can't build it. So we're going to start to see disruptions caused by these unicorn kind of things that are going to start to pop up, and then it's going to become more widespread, right? Because you're going to have basically what we're seeing now is impacts in that previous, your last slide, where it was 70 and 75%. That's going to start to feed its way down to the consumer. What the number was 45%. That's going to start to go up, and that's just because the way that the inventories and the materials from raw material through for the working process and finished goods, how that supply chain actually rolls. The logistics part of it is really probably going to be a little bit more of a labor issue. Make sure you get the drivers and the trucks and the networks moving properly. There might be workers that don't show up for work at a warehouse or something to that effect, either because of fear or because actually they have they have limited amount of workers, and so there's going to be different issues. I mean, until this thing kind of becomes stabilized, there's going to be these ongoing issues of clear to build, which I think is kind of a natural consequence of complexity in supply chain management.
And I think it's really interesting what you talked about, the human supply chain, right? Because people operate factories for the most part. People are needed to fill out and get a transportation and logistics transaction executed. And so the human supply chain, and in a situation like this where people aren't quite comfortable coming back to their jobs, that means you could have a situation, and we are seeing this, where you are classified as an essential business. You're allowed to work, but you're not able to because your employees are too nervous, or you as an organization may be unwilling to accept the potential liability or risk of people getting sick while at work. And as a result, you don't have skilled experts who are supposed to be doing certain functions that could cause an entire factory to be disrupted, or issues with your transportation and logistics transaction execution. And we've seen these types of disruptions that are not material related, but people related.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. Fear is one of the biggest human emotions, right? I mean, when people have a fear, right, it tends to linger. It's not like it just doesn't go away quickly. A good example was I'm in the state of Georgia, where the governor famously said he was opening up on Friday and Monday, opening the state gradually back up again, including fitness centers. So my fitness center contacted me right away and said, no, we're not opening. So even though, some politicians may play certain games with the situation for purposes that are different, I think fear is still a strong motivation. And I'm sure the fitness center that I go to, the people who work there are like, we're not going back to work. I don't care what the boss says. We saw, and we're going to see other issues in Singapore. In the Wall Street Journal, they had a very good article on this yesterday about the dormitories. And, they had a new outbreak in Singapore, which was really in the construction worker dormitories, where they use workers from, Bangladesh and other countries. And there was a big outbreak there, and it actually caused the whole country to get shut down again. And here in China, or over in China, a lot of the manufacturing operation there is operate with remote workers who actually come in, and they actually stay in dormitories as well. And I just wonder, as this thing opens up again, how many workers are actually going to want to show up and share a room with 4 or 6 more people. Same with universities, same with all kinds of other operations around the world that rely on workforces that bring labor in from other places. So I think we're going to see workforce challenges like that are going to be trickling around for more, even longer than the immediate impacts we're seeing because of some of the manufacturing issues at the production level.
And I think one other thing we're hearing is that even the areas where governments are allowing, for example, China, where we hear a lot that China is getting back to normal, China is getting back to normal. This is kind of the theme right now. we are seeing that in reality, the situation on the ground is fairly constrained in that, for example, factories have to go through a list of very stringent compliance measures before they're allowed to reopen. Among other things, they need to protect their employees, provide masks and other PPE type items to keep them protected, and then also practice social distancing to a large extent, which, as you know, in factories, this is one of the most difficult things to implement. And then finally, we do see that, government has made it mandatory that it's, in some cases, even if one factory worker has a positive test, the entire site needs to shut down. And so there are these types of things that are kind of preventing supply chains from really coming back to normal. So I think if we kind of look at that, then what we see is that this continuous stream of demand disruption and supply disruption, the inability to come back to a normal in a consistent way, puts a tremendous amount of pressure on farms. So when we looked at this, so John, if you go to the next slide, when we looked at how does this affect companies, particularly small and medium-sized companies, this was a survey that was done in responses received as of mid-February for companies in China. And this was something where the suppliers, more than 6,000 suppliers responded, and they talked about how many months of cash do they have on hand. And what was really scary was that more than 75% of companies talked about having 3 months or less of cash on hand. And now we are at the 3-month mark, right? And that's what we see is that it was recently reported that more than 460,000 Chinese farms shut down in the first quarter alone. Even registration of new farms in China fell almost 30% from last year. So Tom, talk about this a little bit. I mean, given that we all depend so much on smaller suppliers, particularly, we may think we buy everything from a U.S. European supply chain, but chances are they buy something from a sub-tier supplier that might be in China. So talk about how we can predict and read into and plan for this particular disruption.
Yeah, so, supply chains are really material in motion, which is another way of saying cash in motion. So whenever cash dries up in supply chains, it tends to cause a disruption because cash is required to buy material, to produce the material, to move the material until somebody is paid. So this entire procure-to-pay cycle happens, and cash moves back and forth, up and down supply chains. And generally, it tends to accumulate near the tops of supply chains. That's why we have so many large corporations with large amounts of cash. But that's not necessarily true as you go down the supply chain, unless there's some IP or exclusivity associated with the company involved. So I think what's really important to happen here is to understand, first of all, where you have problems, and then be proactive. So, take your Resolink data. If it identifies where you have an issue, then you create a secondary communication process with that company that basically, maybe it's the two CFOs having a conversation about the financial situation. If you can't wait for Dun & Bradstreet to tell you what's going on. You can't wait to understand what might be happening. You've got to be really on top of understanding how the companies in the supply chain are doing, and not to be afraid to contact a supplier that's a tier below your current supplier. Sometimes, there are so many layers in a supply chain of buffers of communication that it's very important that you understand what the critical kill shots are in your supply chain. What's going to bring you, what will really bring you down might be a single source supplier. Understand, if you have a single source supplier, what that supplier's dependencies are, so that you can reach out and have those conversations. And if necessary, CEO to CEO conversations, or at a minimum, Chief Procurement Officer, Chief Supply Chain Officer communications to suppliers at this time are really important. I mean, everybody's at home. Everybody could have a Zoom meeting. So So these are around the world, which we're all doing. So I think it's important that some of the old school kind of connections are made after you identify the problem. So identify the problem, use the data that identifies it, and then once you know what it is, don't sit there and wait for it to get better. Understand if there's something that you can do, understand what they're doing about it, and basically try to keep the flow going in your supply chain. Because when you have friction in a supply chain, a disruption is basically friction. It causes a supply chain to break down. So keep it moving, understand the critical dependencies, understand it one or two tier down, open lines of communication at a higher executive or a higher level than you might have in the past, and really get into it, really get underneath it.
Tom, I think one other thing that yesterday when we were talking that, John, if you go to the next slide, right, one of the things you talked about, which was how do we look at and predict what is happening in China, and you called it, it's like a canary in a coal mine. Talk about that. As you can see from this chart here on the page right now, where we're looking at total bankruptcy filings year over year for going back almost over 10 years. And you look at just the first quarter of 2020. I mean, if we annualize this number, this could be the biggest year for bankruptcies if we are not careful. So talk about what we should all be predicting and expecting over the next couple of months.
Well, I think, a good example was I think it was February 17th when Apple announced that they were going to have an impact. And basically that was early, right? No one else had given a warning against their guidance. And their market cap collapsed right away because they were like one of the early people to say, Houston, we have a problem. But I think every company, every organization should make sure you understand what are the canaries in your coal mine, right? What are you going to look to as the signals that you've got a bigger problem? And it oftentimes, as you point out, Bindia, it's very deep in the supply chain. It could be one of those third-tier suppliers that all of a sudden can supply a raw material or a chemical or something that would be very important to the next level of your supply chain. And when it breaks down, it tends to collapse almost like a dam collapses. It doesn't collapse from on top; it collapses from down below. So it it's this deep in the supply chain issue. So know where your canaries are and understand what you need to be listening for. So that you're not surprised. I mean, India, as you know, when we talked before, even years ago, about the situation in Fukushima in Japan, where the auto industry had a really sharp collapse after the tsunami. And it was really predicated on the fact that probably a lack of a depth of understanding in some of those levels of their supply chain. Well, the same is happening right now, only on a more widespread basis. That doesn't mean that you can't navigate around it if you're second sourced and multi-sourced. I think just to give a little shout out here, Bindi and I worked on an article for the Harvard Business Review in March, which actually talked through the importance of multi-source or dual source at a minimum as a way of mitigating this. If you've got a breakdown in one country, as you can see in some of the data we just looked at, maybe you can move that production to another country, or more importantly, from even within the same company, not country, but you could, one company is building in multiple places, just move the production to someplace else. So, I mean, there's different ways of these kinds of mitigation strategies, but it's also a little bit of a scramble, right? Because look at the situation with masks and hand sanitizers, et cetera. I mean, it's, there's always a scramble. Once people understand that there's an impact, it's kind of like how you get ahead of the crowd to do that. Having data that tells you what the impact is, and then doing something about it immediately. I mean, take action with the data. Don't sit there and say, I just saw where I've got a problem. Resolink just pointed out I have a big problem here. But that day, what are you going to do? Well, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to make sure that you contact that company, make sure you understand and validate the situation, understand what you can do to move that business to somebody else or with that company someplace else, and then start to work your way through if there's excess inventory that might be, if it's a standardized commodity that you can buy, how do you then go into distribution to buy that? There's different things that procurement, supply chain people can do to help mitigate the impacts, so you don't have, as I said in the beginning, a clear to bill problem where you might be missing something that prevents you from shipping a product.
Absolutely. And so I think one of the things, John, if you go to the next slide, one of the things we talk about very much and very often is the need to look at the entire supplier base and segment it not just by spend. And I'm glad you talked about PPE, Tom, because if you look at a spend-based segmentation in a typical hospital or healthcare organization, then quite honestly, the total amount spent on PPE isn't even 3%, right? So it's really, PPE is one of the lowest spend items on a category basis. But if you look at the activities of a hospital, you need PPE from the time a patient walks in the door to the time the patient leaves. The entire time you need PPE, which means if you look at the impact to operations, or in the case of a commercial organization, the impact to revenue of losing that item, then that gives you a sense for what is truly critical. And PPE would definitely be one of those things that would show up as one of the highest impacting items for a hospital or healthcare provider. So what we're showing you here is a different way to look at your supply chain. It kind of synthesizes everything you heard today from Tom, but it gives you a little bit of a framework. So between this slide and the next slide, what we are showing you is, rather than focus your supply chain and procurement activities and segment your suppliers typically by spend, we highly recommend taking a revenue impact or impact assessment view. Hey, if I lose this supplier, if I lose this site, if I lose this part, which of my products can't I ship? And then create this type of an assessment where you put the supplier name, the spend side by side with revenue impact, and then as you can see in the middle there with the funnel, right? There are multiple ways to assess your supplier's financial health. Obviously, if you're a wrestling client and we are monitoring profit warnings, force majeures, any kind of supplier lawsuits or major announcements or categories, we're alerting our customers about that. Additionally, our customers also get, typically if you look at your suppliers, 40% of your suppliers are likely to be publicly traded, in which case they have financial disclosure requirements, which data can easily be mined, and companies like DNB, Credit Risk Monitor, do mine this data and create a financial score. For the privately held companies, typically we see companies use a solution like Rapid Ratings or Credit Risk Monitor, or they do their own in-house assessments by talking to the supplier quarterly. The idea is not to just rely on tools and outside data sources, but to Tom's point, meet CEO and CFO of your critical suppliers and really get a sense for what does their demand picture look like, what is their outlook on cash, inventories, and weeks of runway. Are they generating cash from operations? Do they have access to debt and capital, etc.? One key best practice and a key caveat that I have here is that companies should not use this information to basically hurt the supplier further. Transparency should never be punitive. If the supplier is transparent, they truly share their challenges and issues with you, then that should always be used to be a solution. You need to be part of the solution, help them in different ways. So Tom, we'll switch to the next slide, and I really want to dig in on this slide. I think this is a toolkit, a framework that we recommend for how companies can get involved, prop up the suppliers, and we've discussed this extensively. Can you talk about, from your experience, on the ground stories from the past, and what you recommend in these situations?
So once you have identified a supplier that's in crisis, once you've identified a supplier that does face a situation like we saw with the data from China, maybe they only have 2 months of cash left. They're burning it quickly. They're not getting enough cash to recover. They potentially could go bankrupt within 90 days. This is a time when you need to have a conversation with your CFO. You need to have a conversation internally with your company about what is the best use of cash of your company now. And sometimes it may be good to offer no interest loans to critical suppliers. At LG during the 2008-2009 economic crisis, I was able to get like $34 million that we had in cash, but use that cash as a way to provide loans to critical suppliers in the supply chain as a way of shoring up their cash position without, similar to what the U.S. government is doing, where you pay it back afterwards. But a no interest loan, which actually holds them over so that they can keep production going, they can continue to buy materials, they continue to operate until things get better. And these crisis situations, which unfortunately, like in your previous chart, India, tend to be the private companies because you don't have as much visibility there. Private companies tend to be smaller in size. So this is where it's a very good use of your cash. Another way is, payment terms, offering more favorable payment terms to suppliers so that, maybe you pay them even in advance to keep them going. You might offer them some other backstop purchase order receivables. You might give them, advanced purchase orders or something they can take to their lenders to get more credit so they can shore up their own balance sheet with more cash. But the issue here of helping suppliers is actually, I don't want to be an alarmist, but time is of the essence. Bankruptcies are one of the things that happen when, you can have profitable companies that are doing great that go bankrupt just because they haven't built enough of a buffer of cash to actually hold them over during demand drops or other crises like resources being impacted, like with COVID. And I think this is the ideal time, going back to what I said in the beginning, find out where those problems are, have the conversations, dispatch the right people to have those conversations, and then take action to actually make sure that your supply chain is not going to be disrupted by something you could actually prevent, something that actually could be done now to help out the situation.
I think what's really important is to quickly mention that, this is not an altruistic thing that companies should be doing for suppliers. This is something that is very much self-serving. Companies should, what we see and what I've seen in my career, I lived through and led a huge initiative when I was at Cisco in 2008 to do this type of a response to supplier bankruptcies in the aftermath of the big financial crash of 2008. And we really looked at which suppliers had the maximum revenue impact to us that also were very difficult to replace. And then we kind of looked at the financial health and all of that, sat down with the suppliers, and were very much part of the solution. A lot of the things you see on this slide, we did work on with our suppliers, tailored it to what would help them ride out the rough times. But it's really important to note that what we saw in the years after this is the suppliers who we really were good partners with, good corporate citizens with, and were part of their success and helped them ride out the tough times. We were always, as a customer, we had better standing during the good times. We got good, preferential treatment when allocations, which, in supply chain, you're going to get the next allocation situation, if not now, then in the next 6 months. Having these types of deep supply chain partnerships is really critical to get, suppliers to be on your side during these future disruptions. So you're really investing in your own future, including during good times. Suppliers were more willing to work with us and meet our cost-saving targets and needs. So I think this is a really important time. Companies like Lockheed Martin and many others have announced publicly that they are setting aside, X millions of dollars. And it's a really good way for you to encourage your suppliers to make these announcements and encourage them to come to you and be transparent and ask for help. So with that, one other topic that Tom want to talk about, if you go to the next slide, is the force majeure, situation. There are a lot of force majeure type certifications that are getting filed in China. We see that, the Chinese Council for Promotion of International Trade received and actually issued 4,800 force majeure certifications as of early March. And you can see the industries where these were allowed and issued. And you can also see the amount of data that references the term force majeure right now as we analyze across what's in public domain. And this is definitely something that we're going to get hit with if we haven't already been hit with this. So talk about this in terms of supply chain disruptions and how companies can manage this, not only now, but for the future.
Well, first, don't think that a contract or a purchase order is going to protect you now. Because if China is an example here, or anybody starts to declare it's an act of God or force majeure, and it was something out of their control, it releases them of their obligations. So I think it's really important to start to operate relationally with your suppliers rather than contractually, because force majeure is very obvious in this case, just because the COVID-19 pandemic was not something that the company caused. It wasn't something they did wrong. It's something that came to them and came to everyone at the same time. So it's going to be very difficult to go down a contractual way. You promised me you were going to do this. You said you were going to send me this or do that or this. It's not going to work. I think you really have to shift gears here and not get too caught up on the legal entanglement of what contracts say or don't say, or what purchase orders say or don't say. I think this is a time to really be flexible and agile with your suppliers. If necessary, help them solve their own problems rather than wait to have them solve them for you. It's a different dynamic, because I would believe that most companies, whether they be in the West or the East, I think most of them have grounds for a force majeure implementation, which basically says this was out of my control. My obligations really were disrupted by things that I could not contain. Therefore, I'm not obligated to. I said I was going to do this many per month, but now I can't, and therefore, they can't even say sue me, because if they get sued, courts will throw it out because of the contractual clause for force majeure. So I think it's very important, I think, to just avoid going down a heavy contractual path with your suppliers at this point, and to try to do something to be creative, flexible, and to adapt to the reality of the situation.
I think one other thing, two kind of more tactical things that you can think of that are very much within the control of procurement and supply chain experts that may be helpful and appreciated by your suppliers at this time. One is see if you have done supply chain mapping, then this is a no-brainer. Identify where some of your suppliers' most expensive raw materials might be, and help them source those. That might provide, even on the previous topic, it might give them some cash relief, where companies do this sometimes, where they'll consign that material back to the supplier at a discount, and help them out to source those. The second is you may have imposed some expensive requirements from a compliance standpoint, some of which could be relaxed. I'm not saying you can relax anything on the quality or legal side, obviously. That compliance needs to happen. But if there are any requirements that you have imposed upon your suppliers, these are some things where you could make it a little bit easier for the supplier to comply and or relax those requirements and work with you. All of these types of small things together build up and support and prop up the supplier during these times. If we go to the next slide, I think we kind of talked about the workforce challenges. So I'm going to skip this a little bit right now in the interest of time and just talk really quickly. I want to take a couple of questions before we end. I have one last slide to talk about, which is about the exchange. I think many of you know ResLink launched the healthcare exchange a couple of last week. We've already started to see healthcare organizations request materials and make offers. We saw the first couple of exchanges start to happen between hospitals. One of the things that I wanted to talk about is just if you're a hospital or a healthcare organization, please do join. And then if you are a life science medical device or any company that might be able to or has successfully sourced PPEs, then please do join the exchange and see if you could donate some of that. Because obviously this is a great way for you to reach out to a nationwide network of hospitals. There are hospitals in ResLink's exchange all the way from Maine to Hawaii. And so this is a great way for you to make an impact and help out our healthcare organizations in their time of need. So with that, we'll go to take some questions before we end this call. So I don't know if, John, back to you.
Well, thanks. Thanks, Bindia. Thanks, Tom. That was really great. I think really insightful. So thanks a lot. I think a couple of, we're getting questions and I'm trying to shuffle through them here in real time. We're getting, I think there's a lot of interest. I think a lot of people share your concern on the workforce side. And I'm just trying to pull together a couple of questions here. It really seems that there's a lot of interest. I think people are also struggling with their own workforce, obviously. So companies' workforce, and then they're concerned around the suppliers. I guess. Well, I think, why don't we do this, Bindia? I think we're getting near the top of the hour. Just as the good host, I'm getting to wrap up. Tom, did you have any kind of final thoughts as you mentioned? I think you correctly pointed out that we're sort of in the mid time period now of this whole thing, and I think we're in agreement. What would you suggest if you were advising CPOs that are listening or other senior executives? What would you suggest they do now in preparation for the coming months?
Well, I think everybody's got war rooms at this point, and basically understands what their scenarios look like. I think I'd break it down into a couple of different scenarios, a fast recovery, a slow recovery, and a long recovery, and basically have action plans for each one of those scenarios. But I also liked what the Starbucks CEO said yesterday, where he talked about, they're going to monitor and adapt. I think being able to pivot and being adaptable right now, we've got the monitoring in place pretty much for the companies that are basically have been engaged. And now it's really a question of, what adaptation strategies. Basically evolution, always favors those who are prepared and can adapt. I mean, if you look at, all the theories around that, the companies that actually can adjust and adapt, will survive. The dinosaurs didn't make it, right? Because they didn't adapt. So how can we, as a company, as an individual, adapt and survive? And there will be a time to thrive again. This is not that time. But right now, it's important to figure out, dig down deep, and understand those adaptations necessary in your supply chain in order to make it happen.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Bindia. Thanks, everybody, for participating. I think we need to wrap up. We're hitting the time period here, but we will provide another update in a couple of weeks according to our schedule. So thanks a lot, and everyone be safe out there. One quick note before we do. is again, thanks to all those on the front lines, the first responders, the medical community. Thanks again for all that you do and keep us safe and healthy. So thanks again. We do this each week, and just wanted to say that before we wrap up. So thanks everybody, and be safe.